Please comment where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you enjoy the content. When I close my eyes, I can still see it, as if the road, the headlights, and that awful shape were frozen in one searing frame. It was around 1 a.m, my friend snoring in the back seat like nothing in the world could touch her, my mother driving with that careful, grim focus older women get on lonely roads, and me fighting the impossible sleep that comes after a concert and too much adrenaline. We were somewhere along that thin ribbon of asphalt near Harrisonburg, the mountains folding into black on either side, so close you felt like the world had pinched shut. The headlights carved out a little rectangle ahead of us, and that was all the world I knew. Then it filled the rectangle. It wasn't a bat or an owl the way my brain tried to file it later. The thing was too big, too impossibly long. For a breath, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10, it blocked the road as if the universe had decided to drape a living shadow across our path. The wings were wrong, not feathered exactly, more like the matte, armored wings of something that had been designed to move through thick air and substrate, folded tight to its sides. They hung there like the arms of a person at rest, and its body, Jesus, its body read human before it read anything else. Gray skin, bald head, a face that was like a stranger's face stitched onto a bird's body. It moved sideways in a slick, liquid motion, right in front of the headlights, and we should have hit it. We didn't. I remember thinking, with that hyper-lucid clarity of a frightened mind, that the thing could have been 6 feet alone, and that its wings made it seem twice as wide. My mother swore later she saw the same pale crown of a head, and the same wrongness of movement. We kept driving. We didn't stop. I still wonder if not stopping was cowardice or instinct, whether curiosity would have killed us slower than whatever that creature would have done if we'd slammed the brakes and jumped out. The memory of its face, so human, so vacant, sits behind my eyes like a stone. After that night, I couldn't shake it. My dad used to tell me the Mothman stories, all the old radio cadence about Point Pleasant in the 60s, about couples seeing eyes at the TNT site and the town's uneasy hum for months after. Those tales morphed from campfire fodder into obsession. You tell yourself you go look because you want answers. You shouldn't be surprised when part of you wants to be close to fear the way lovers brush skin, because being near it proves you are still alive. So, on the 53rd anniversary of that first recorded sighting, I packed a car with the kind of friends who laughed too loudly to be reasonable, and with my stepbrother and stepsister who'd roll their eyes at the very idea of anything paranormal. Katie and Joanna arrived later that afternoon, cheeks flushed with miles and wine. Katie caught my eye in the museum and grinned in that way that felt like a dare. She leaned in on the cramped couch between rusted artifacts and insisted on reading every plaque aloud in a breathy, theatrical whisper. When she laughed, it was a low sound that cupped my name, and for a beat, stupid and human and embarrassing, I felt like this whole trip had been organized to make my heart race for reasons beyond cryptids. By night, we were driving toward the TNT area under a moon that made everything look unreal. The gate was supposed to stop cars, but not our footfall. Someone joked that we'd be famous if we caught anything on camera. We carried headlamps and cheap recording gear, rubbish bravado in backpacks that smelled of basil and cigarettes. The bunker looms in my memory like the mouth of something that had been left to rust. The air smelled like iron and old concrete. We wandered the ruins, snapping pictures and trying on bravado like thick coats. Katie held my hand to steady herself on the slick, mossy steps, but when she did it felt electric and shockingly intimate. There was a heat there, improper, dangerous, that made me pay attention to every small movement she made. When she brushed her thumb across my knuckle, the touch was an excuse to say something stupid and flirtatious to slice the fear. If anything eats us, I'll make sure you go first. She laughed, and the laugh was thin and brittle. We found a clearing where the bunker opened like a throat, and that's when Joanna and my stepsister saw eyes. 2 points of light, reflective and small and patient, watching from the gloom. They turned and faded like a memory, then returned closer. We told ourselves it was coyotes, I shine in the beam, maybe a deer. That's what we told ourselves for 3 heartbeats until the eyes hardened red. When the thing stepped into the light, we saw height, tall, too tall, and an uncoiling of movement that wasn't animal the way a fox is animal. It straightened, and the sound it made was not a cry but a mechanical, ancient roar that scraped under my ribs and set off a white-hot drum in my ears. Katie screamed and ran, falling hard into gravel. Her skin, when I pulled her up, tasted like salt and sunflower oil. She smelled like a summer bar and something older, sweat and adrenaline and a courage that made me love her in the most panicked, immediate way. I didn't process the fact that the creature had begun to charge, I just hauled her into the car, slammed the door, and pressed the gas. The next few seconds are a blur. The axles whining, the speedometer flickering like a fevered pulse, the road a ribbon of white. The creature, if it was the same shape from my memory of that highway years before, tracked us with those stupid, terrible red eyes. It roared again, an ancient alarm, and for one impossible second I felt a private, obscene thrill. Terror and an animal sort of arousal braided together, because nothing signals vitality like the sight of something that could kill you. We were doing 100 on a 35 road, and I knew every cop and moral fiber I had snapped like thread. We crossed the gate and left the TNT zone in a blur of gravel and bad decisions. Back at the hotel, hands still trembling, we tried to be sensible. We rationalized, big bird deer, a local pulling a prank. But the way Katie's breath hitched every time she spoke, the way the room smelled of gasoline and fear, spoke to something different. We had a recording, a few shaky pictures, and the taste of it in our mouths, metal old winter, and something like regret. We planned, foolish and earnest, to come back with better tech, night vision, thermal cams, microphones. We swore we'd get proof. June 14th, 1899, Captain's Log, SS Adiani. We sighted an object astern at first light, like an overturned skiff. Men at the rail called it curious. Approaching, the thing rose, great and long, a back like a curved keel, and a head that cut the water like a prow. She opened her mouth and exposed teeth like a saw. We struck her amidships. She heaved and sank beneath our paddle rollers with a sound I cannot name. Many on board swore she had eyes like a bull and scales that gleamed green. I confess to writing this with hands that still shake. None of us boarded her. The water took her and the story with her. Frederick R., pilot. They called it Old Greena then, and they call it Old Greena now. The story, part steamboat drama, part fishing lore, folds into the Finger Lakes like a seam, stitched and frayed in turns. Some nights the town historian will recite the 1899 account with a reverent rasp. Other nights the fishermen of Geneva will joke about it over coffee and say the monster makes a better tourist than a threat. But the archive is stubborn. Old newspapers, yellow and brittle, list names and times. The Geneva Gazette reported a creature 25 feet long, dragged under the Adiani's hull. The account is either bravado or truth, depending on whether you want a monster to swim beneath your keel. Weeks after the newspapers, fast forward more than a century, locals still rear on the scene the way a family tells the story of a lost cousin. At the dock the current smells like algae and diesel, and I meet Tom Raines, a man who smells of tackle box grease and decades of early mornings. Tom's wife runs a B&B that uses a stylized serpent in its logo, and his eyes narrow when he talks about sonar. "You asking me if I believe it?" he says, fingers tracing the grain of the pier. "I've seen big fish. Sturgeon, eel, old ones get huge. But what people saw back then, people saw something different. There's a feeling, like water knows you're looking." He spits, and the phrase hangs. 2 words from a man who has nothing to gain from superstition, but a lot to gain from a story that keeps people at the lake after Labor Day. Between Tom's smoke and the Historical Society's lamp-lit room sits Mira, an archivist obsessed with proving the creature isn't just local color. She keeps photocopies and first editions, sometimes in a stack so high it threatens the table's surface. There were at least 20 reported sightings before 1929, she says, sweeping a hand over clippings. Different formats, different witnesses. And then the Adiani. You can't get a report that big and say it's all imagination. She pulls out a yellowing photograph of a steamer deck crowded with men in stiff collars and points to a smear in the water. "Look," she murmurs. Something was there. Myra's treasure is an old passenger diary recovered from a family estate. Faint ink, a woman's cramped hand noting the day's chill, and then the odd excitement on deck. I read it in the low light of the Society's office. We rushed, and the thing rolled its dark back like a sleeping animal. Then it lifted its head and looked at us. The diary is 2 parts wonder and 1 part terror. The writer confesses to wanting to take the animal home like a curiosity, and then feeling ashamed of the thought. Myra's obsession is not to sensationalize, but to pin down what the town almost remembers. If you can file memory, you might file evidence. Not all files behave. In a small university lab nearby, Dr. Elena Voss runs sonar sweeps across Seneca's deep pockets, a scientist trying to translate myth into data. Her boat smells of antifreeze and cheap coffee. Stacks of printouts sit like confessions. The sonar picks up anomalies occasionally, she says, tapping a pale graph. Mass echoes at depth, objects with elongated bodies that defy standard swim patterns. Her tone is careful, scientist sober, but her eyes flicker when she describes one echo that moved like a waking animal beneath a thermocline. Could be a school of sturgeon, could be a submerged log, but sometimes the echo moves too deliberately. One of Elena's dilemmas is ethical. If something unknown indeed lives in the lake, do you wake it with a submersible? Her team debated whether to send a diver down in 2013 after a reported sighting by a professional diver who swore he'd glimpsed something 30 feet long, mottled with a flat head. The diver withdrew, he said later, because the thing had an expression that made him feel foolish. It looked right at me, he told a reporter. Not aggressive, just old, annoyed. The university committee decided not to disturb the depth then. The specter of scientific hubris loomed larger than the desire to document. There is an angler named Harold whose story complicates the rational tracks. He is an unreliable narrator in the best way, man who has, by his own admission, drowned a marriage with drink and tries to sell yarns for a kind of redemption. I saw a head once, Harold says at the bait shop, slapping a cold beer down. Big as a barrel. Not a fish head. It watched me. He sobers at the memory. His voice loses its salesmanship. He claims the creature followed his boat for miles, trailing a wake that smelled of old sea and river rot. When Harold speaks, his hands shake. The town shrugs and listens, and then buys his photographs of nothing. People like Harold keep the legend human-sized, messy, flawed, and believable because he's fallible. The human cost of myth is often obscured by spectacle. In 1974, a teenager fisherman alleged his arm was crushed and his shout turned to rumor. The family kept quiet. The mother, whose laugh used to ring in church basements, still watches the lake from time to time and traces the water with a gaze that never warms. We lost a son, she says without drama. We weren't the only ones. That kind of grief gets folded into the town fabric, an unmarked grave of memory beneath the popular postcards selling finicky postcards of sunrise and fog. Local tourism officials, recognizing the hunger for mystery, package the ambiguity into a perk. There are t-shirts, a plush version of Old Greenie in the visitor center, and an annual monster walk, where kids parade in cardboard fins. The chamber director, Pola, defends it as small-town reinvention. We aren't cashing in on tragedy, she insists. We celebrate our stories. People come for the folklore, sure, but they also stay for the restaurants and the farmers' market. Yet there's a pressure that is not entirely mercantile. The town depends on the tale to remain interesting, and interesting requires a hint of danger. Here the story's life becomes economic, a commodity that wants to be believed. Folklore never fully surrenders to science or commerce. It lives in the edges. In one modern interview, I sat in a diner with a woman whose son vanished near Cayuga in the 1980s. She refused to talk to reporters for years. I don't want your pity, she told me, voice tight like a fist. But ask me about the sound the water makes when it's trying to remember something. Later she said, sometimes I think I'd rather believe in a monster than the idea that water is just empty. That sentence, like a slow tide, tells you why myths persist. They give the world shape when shape is otherwise unkind. We parked where the road narrowed into nothing but trees, shouldered our packs, and hiked a mile inland because we wanted to be away from the weekend campers, away from drunk strangers, music, and the thing everyone loves to call the experience. Diane and I wanted quiet, some screenless time together, no clinking cans, no one's breath on our necks while we tried to sleep. That night the clearing we picked was perfect, a little bowl of flat ground rimmed with trees, the lake a black mirror just beyond the treeline. Sunset smeared violet across the sky, and we drank in the slow, stupid contentment of it, trading stories and slow kisses over a fire that smelled like pine and beer. The first scream was a thin thing, like a throat scraping across rusty metal. It cut the air so sharp I startled and nearly dropped my marshmallow. Diane sat up and said, half joking, "What the hell was that?" We both laughed, because we always laughed to push the cold out of the bones, and said it was probably a deer or some idiot shouting. But the birds went crazy up in the trees in waves, and the sound didn't match any animal I'd heard before. It was wrong in a place words find only after a while. We tried to ignore it, drank, smoked, told the dumb ghost story jokes couples tell to make the dark smaller. The night came in quick and velvet. The fire shrank to embers, and we crawled into our little tent, the world thinning to the zip and the inhale of the sleeping bag. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a thud outside the tent, like something heavy dropping on wet wood. Diane, half asleep, mumbled, "What is it?" And I squeezed her shoulder and told her it was probably a raccoon. She rolled over, phone light soft against her face, and muttered something about being cold. I watched the black seam of trees through the tent fabric, and that's when I heard the second sound, a huge swoop, like something enormous had passed over the tent and the air had turned viscous. When I say huge, I mean it in a way you don't really think about until you're in the thing. The sky felt smaller. Every insect hushes because something big has moved through the air. There was a second of absolute silence, and then a scream that was not an animal scream and not a human scream. It was like an amplifier blowing out something that had never been meant to be heard by ears. The sound made my teeth hurt. Diane shot up, grabbed my arm, and there was terror in her face. Not the ephemeral movie-form terror, but the kind that is sharp and immediate and smells like fear. She climbed out of the tent like a person surfacing from a dick-deep sleep, not graceful, and shined the phone flashlight around the clearing. For a moment the beam just caught trees. Then it found the fawn we'd seen earlier, huddled on the grass with its back badly damaged. 2 gouges in its fur, blood dark and crusted between the vertebrae. No other wounds, no entrails, nothing. It was as if something had lifted the deer, bitten down just along the spine, and left it there like a note. "Jesus," Diane whispered. The smell of copper hung in the air, faint but there, like someone had cracked a penny open and let it breathe. I said something stupid, about a really big bird, and she shot me a look that told me how ridiculous that idea sounded. Then, as we leaned in to put the deer out of its misery, something moved in the trees. We saw it as soon as Diane pointed the light toward the pines, a silhouette 8 to 10 feet tall, not quite human. It glared at us, and I swear its eyes were red orbs, mutant lanterns set in the face of a thing that didn't divide head and torso the way we do. It looked like it wore a cloak of feathers that flowed straight into long, terrible wings. When it extended those wings, the motion wasn't graceful. It was like a curtain being slammed open. It then screamed. God, that scream. My ears folded in pain and my vision wavered. I think I said a swear. Diane grabbed me, steady and solid, squeezed me like a lifeline, and the noise swallowed my sense of time. I don't remember the next minute clearly. I remember the sensation of falling away. A dark like the world had closed its eyes. Diane later told me she'd shaken me, shouted my name until she thought her throat would break, and then dragged me out of the tent. The last thing I remember before the blackout was her face, up close, lips moving in a wordless prayer or a curse, maybe both. She told me later that she saw it lift off, like a damn fighter jet, sprinting into the trees and vanishing. She said she carried me to the car, folded me into the back seat like a piece of furniture, and then sat there, out of breath, rocking, until dawn bled into the clearing. When I came to, my head was in my hands and the world had that ringing that feels like you were standing too close to thunder. Diane was at the wheel, silent and driving us back along the road while the weak sun cut across the windshield. My ears buzzed, my heart was an animal, and a weird coldness clung to my bones like frost. "You okay?" she said, voice steady and clipped. "You blacked out." She didn't ask how or why. She only said she'd carried me back and waited until the light came. And then, with this sort of tired half-sarcastic note she always uses when she's trying to be brave, she said, "You owe me dinner for saving your dumb ass." We kept that joke as a rope across the next weeks. It's useful to laugh when the line between what happened and what we tell ourselves gets thin. We told friends differently, once like a horror story with and then we ran beat, once like a thing to laugh at, and sometimes we were quiet. After the event, I found myself on message boards and forums, somewhere people trade names for things they can't prove. The word Mothman floated up a lot. People like tidy folklore. It has caps and dates and names and ominous warnings. But whatever it was, it didn't act like a myth. It moved fast. It screamed like a horror movie speaker. It left a deer half dead on the grass. The rawest part is still the feeling that came after. The intimate terror that makes you grateful for the person who's there to drag you home. Diane's actions that night mattered more than any single explanation. She handled me with a kind of angry tenderness I hadn't seen before, hands that could be gentle and also fierce. There's a physicalness to that. The way she pulled my jacket over me with fingers that smelled of smoke, the brief, ridiculous intimacy of her slipping her shirt off to wrap my head against the cold. We laughed later, embarrassed and a little horny at the ridiculousness of making out in a car after nearly witnessing what might be a cryptid attack. It's human. You press toward warmth when the world threatens to take it away. I still think about that scream at odd hours. Sometimes I wake with my ears full of that sound, and I have to tell myself that I survived. We live in a town where people joke about omens and legends, where tourism offices sell t-shirts with grinning Mothmen. But for us, it wasn't merch. It was a thing that put its presence between us and the dark and made me grateful for the woman who carried me, and for the way that when the world grows monstrous, some people respond by becoming absolutely, beautifully human. So yeah, we joke. The wound heals into a scar you forget until someone mentions Mothman at a party, and then the memory flashes up like a streetlight. We plan trips back sometimes, as foolish as we are. The summer I turned 14, Mexico felt like an open secret, hot air, mango-scented evenings, and the kind of small-town rhythms that make every story feel like it's already been told. My uncle loved the outdoors. He'd taught me how to get a fish and tie a snare, how to listen to the wind and name birds by their calls. So when his friend Carlos said he was going out to the lake alone that night to cast a net and check a trap, nobody thought twice. Carlos fished alone more than anyone else I knew. He liked the quiet, and he was the kind of man whose life fit into a small house filled with gear and little trophies of trout. Folks around town said he carried the sort of loneliness that clung like fish scales, useful, practical, necessary. That night the moon was full and pale, a coin balanced above the water. I can still see how it slicked the lake's surface into a perfect smear of silver. My cousins and I were supposed to be asleep, but I stayed up waiting for my uncle to come off shift. The plans for tacos at midnight felt sacred. Around 2 a.m, we heard frantic knocking on the door, like someone running out of breath. My grandmother stumbled over the rug with a shawl around her shoulders. There was a single lantern, and the house smelled like slow-cooked beans and salt air. When she opened the door, we all froze. Carlos stood there pale as the moon, his face stripped of color, so that the lines around his mouth looked carved. He wouldn't, at first, meet anyone's eyes. He kept repeating, "No, no, no," like a prayer or like he couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. My uncle grabbed him and guided him inside, hands big and rough from years of oars and rope. His fingers trembled as he took Carlos's shoulders. The man was soaked through like he'd been in the lake himself, and the water made his shirt cling to ribs. When my uncle finally pulled him into a chair, Carlos's hand spilled a little coffee he'd been holding. It left a dark ring on the table, and he didn't seem to notice. "What happened?" my uncle demanded, but his voice was smaller than I expected, which made everyone around the table listen harder. Carlos tried to breathe steady as he talked. I went out to his voice cut, and he rubbed his forehead. He kept saying the same phrases over and over, piecing the night back together like someone sewing a torn sail. Moon was good. Net was quiet. I wasn't catching anything. Then, he flinched as if the memory burned. It came up slow at first, like something had been waiting under the water and decided to walk. He described it not like someone who had read a legend, but like a man who had seen an animal and had to find words that fit. "It stood up," he said, his voice low. "On 2 legs. Scales like a fish, but it was walking. It had a tail short like a stump and red eyes. Eyes like coals. It looked at me like I was the thing it was surprised to see." Each time Carlos said red eyes, he slumped a little in his chair, as if the words took energy out of him. My grandmother sat quiet, her fingers worrying a rosary that had seen many years of prayer. When Carlos said red eyes, she crossed herself. In our town, the old stories aren't tales you tell for laughs. They are warnings passed between mothers and fathers and kids who are told not to swim after dusk. She started to murmur something I couldn't quite catch. Later I would learn she was reciting the story of El Chavrin. El Chavrin isn't a bedtime story where a monster eats children. It's a local curse, a moral tale folded into a myth. A fisherman, the story goes, who made a deal with a dark thing he thought would make him rich, bigger catches, easier nights. He didn't keep his word. They say the bargain twisted him over time until he became the thing he worshipped. Scaled, half-man, and eternally bound to the water. Families use the tale to teach caution, to keep kids from the water at night with the same seriousness some places use stranger danger. Carlos's description matched the legend too perfectly to be coincidence. The red eyes, the stumpy tail, the way it had come out to stand like a man on the shoreline. The thing had eyes that looked right through me, he said. He insisted it hadn't attacked him, only stared, and then walked back into the black like someone slipping off a boat. When he spoke of the water, it was like he could still hear it sucking at the reeds. After he calmed a little, my grandmother told us the old rules again. Don't swim past sunset, don't whistle toward the deep water, and always leave an offering at the lake's edge if you fish after dark. Her voice was steady, but there was iron in her tone. These weren't superstitions to her. She made us promise, like children swearing a pact, that we'd stay close to shore and leave a candle on the bank if we walked by the lake at night. Sitting in the kitchen, the room lit by a single bulb that hummed like a trapped insect, I watched the adults argue in low voices. Some said it was a big iguana, or a fisherman messing with Carlos, or hallucination from moonlight and loneliness. Maybe I thought it was nothing more than the human brain doing what it does, telling stories to fill in the dark. But then I saw Carlos tug at the hem of his shirt, and he pulled out a small scrap of webbed skin, or something like it, thin, silver, and wet. It glinted under the bulb, and no one in the room could offer a plausible explanation for where it came from. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the floor in the main room like an old dog near the cooking fires, listening to the house breathe. Outside, the lake picked up a new voice, gusts moving reeds like a chorus. My cousins were talking in whispers about the thing they'd half heard at the edge of the water when they'd been kids. My uncle went outside once to check the trap lines, and I followed like a shadow. He smoked silently and watched the moonlight scrape over the lake as if to mark the seasons. "Don't go out there alone," he told me without looking back. His voice was not scolding, it was a fact, like weather. In the weeks after, the town hummed with the kind of talk that can be both comforting and corrosive. Some folks laughed and said the lake had gotten new residents, fishermen who brought strange habits. Others pulled their children in close at dusk. Tourists noticed nothing unusual and took photos of the moonlit water, but the people who lived there had shifted the way they moved near the shore. Carlos never went out at night again. He kept to daytime nets and coffee in the mornings, and sometimes he'd fidget with his cup as if he expected the sound of scales shifting underneath. Me? I couldn't stop thinking about the eyes. At 14, you're old enough to know better, but young enough to want to see the things that keep adults up at night. I found myself walking to the water's edge in daylight, peering into a hole of reflected sky and fish. The lake looked ordinary then, blue and bright and full, but in the back of my head I could still hear Carlos's words. It looked at me like I was the thing it was surprised to see. The old stories took another life after that night. El Chavrin walked again in our town's language, spoken as a caution, as a way to explain the unexplainable. My grandmother used it to keep neighbors safe. My cousins used it to dare each other to stay out late. When you're 13, bravery is mostly a performance. It's part swagger and part math. How many dares can you take before the group decides you're a liability? For most of the summer that year I was all feverish courage, the kind that comes from too many comic books and too little sleep, from thinking the world is a place you can boss around if you yell loud enough. I wore my bravery like a second skin. I'd bell out a challenge to any kid who looked at the lake with too much caution, and then sit on the dock and smoke the bottled-up fear through my nostrils like steam. It made me feel grown. We were at the scout camp everyone in our troop knew the route to without checking a map. The place sat where a narrow river bowed into a lake, that thin stretch of water a seam where currents argued and eddies kept their own counsel. On a good day the water there looked like shattered silver. On other nights the confluence muttered in different tongues, ripples against rotten posts, frogs hollering, the hollow creak of the old dock like a slow wooden clock. The adults said the confluence was a good spot for catfish if you're patient. We were 14 boys with poles and a kind of impatience that made patience offensive. My buddy and I had sneaked out after breakfast to beat the crowds. The plan was simple: claim the best spot on the dock, cast, wait, and if nothing bit, invent a story that made our boredom sound heroic. The dock was planked with boards that had finished more summers than anyone could remember. They bowed slightly where you stepped on them, and the nails hummed like old teeth. You could hear the wood under your shoes the way you hear a grandfather's cough when you're too near. I loved that sound. It felt like being inside an old thing, a thing that knew a lot of secrets and didn't give a shit about your jokes. The water that morning was sickly, green-brown, and holding the light like a tired coin. I baited my hook with the care of a kid who wanted to pretend he knew what he was doing. My friend Mark went for the best fishing posture he'd seen in a guy on YouTube. Elbows wide, that look of concentrated boredom on his face. We set up, swapped trash talk, and cast. At first it was nothing but sun and the lazy moan of heat. The pole hummed against the line gently, a small vibrato you'd expect. I leaned back and lit a candy bar in my mouth, more for the show than the hunger. Then the line jerked like a secret being pulled free. It wasn't a graceful tug, it was a hard, insistent yank that sent my knuckles white on the rod. "Finally," I said, louder than I felt. My voice cracked in the way it always did when I tried to sound older. I reeled, slow at first, then faster when I felt resistance. The line hummed higher, like a small chant. I expected the clumsy, noble battle of a catfish, or some old carp that lived its little life flipping and protesting. But as the lure came up under the green surface, my stomach did a small, traitorous flip. Something wrapped around the lure, and did not let go like a child refusing to hand over a toy. The thing clung. I felt its grip through the rod as if something had grabbed my hand. The smell hit me, not fishy, not the brine you might expect, but a wet, earthy stink, like someone had left wet leaves in a bucket and they're starting to vex the air. My breath thinned. Mark leaned in, eyebrows up, not yet knowing if he should be impressed or bored. When the thing finally breached the surface, the world contained itself to that small rectangle around the dock. It wasn't the countably monstrous myth a kid prays for when he wants a story. It was smaller, somehow more intimate, the size of a creature who could clap its hands on your porch and not be grand about it. Its arm looked wrong at first, too long, the skin like an eel's scaled in shivering patches, webbing between stubbed fingers. The hand latched onto the lure with a kind of possessive intelligence. When it turned its head, that's when my stomach dropped properly. Its face was almost human until it wasn't. The nose was flattened, nothing more than a suggestion where nostrils might be, a smooth, pale plane instead of a bridge. The eyes were pits, deep hollows that swallowed light, and then gave it back in a way that made you feel seen like a thing under glass. The mouth was a jag of teeth that made my own teeth ache to look at. It didn't snarl. It didn't look like a thing that wanted to eat you. It looked like a thing that had been waiting to be interesting. I remember holding the rod like it was a live wire. It was the dumb, hard muscle of pure fear that makes you freeze. My legs went weak, and the dock felt like it might tip with me. Mark made the dumb joke he always made when he wanted to cover alarm with humor. "What, you hauling up a mermaid for the county?" And his laugh sounded wrong in the tight air. I don't know if I made a sound. Part of me wanted to yank the line with the stupid, brave yank of a boy proving himself. Instead, I let go in the thing, as if insulted, released the lure and slid back under the murk as if the whole thing had been a test I'd failed. We got off the dock like boys who had just seen something we weren't yet allowed to believe in. My cheeks burned not just with fear, but with the shame of a weakness I could not hide. At the lodge I called it a fish, a snapping fish that surprised me, because admitting the rest would have been to name a thing we didn't have proof of and risk being laughed at. In our troop the law was clear. Don't be the fool who tells a tall tale for attention. Besides, who would believe a kid? Adults preferred their monsters wrapped in newspaper sarcasm and a shrug. That night, though courage failed me again, the image of the scaled hand lingered like a melody stuck inside a head. I needed to see it again, because looking at a thing a second time makes it seem more real, a kind of proof you can hand to yourself. I told myself I'd go back at midnight, once the camp quieted. They were all asleep. The lodge's porch light turned the world into a patch of cleanliness that hid the rest. Mark was in late, snoring trucks like a good roommate. I slipped with a flashlight tucked under my armpit, feeling like a thief. My sneakers squeaked on the path the way they always did, and even the moths seemed to hold their breath as if they were part of the conspiracy. When I reached the dock the moon was low, and the water darker than it had been in the day, a swallowed coin. I walked to the edge where the boards moaned and leaned out, flashlight catching the surface in thin sheets. I expected ripples, a twitch of curiosity. I expected, more than anything, to prove I was the one who'd seen the thing. I wanted to return triumphant. Instead, I found only the old lure still snagged near a snag of weed, its hooks dull in the moon. The water held small, innocent ripples where nothing passed yet. I called out a dumb name, hello, like a ghost in a backyard, and heard my own voice fall small and harmless between the trees. For a long time I stood listening to the lake breathe. Nothing moved but the current and my pulse. I waited until my legs went numb from cold and guilt, and the particular shame of being a liar caught halfway into their own trap. I left the dock with the flashlight's beam skittering over the water and going out like a breath. I get panic attacks. Not the theatrical kind you see in movies where people keel over and clutch their chests. Mine come like someone tightening a band around my ribs until breathing feels like bargaining. I've learned the mechanics, box breathing when I can, naming 5 things I can see to anchor my head back to the room, counting slow exhalations so my lungs remember what they're supposed to do. But none of that makes the first few seconds any less violent. Those seconds always feel like a negotiation between a part of me that trusts the world and another part that's convinced the world is out to get me. We were in a cheap cabin by a lake that weekend because it was cheap and because Mark, my boyfriend then, practical and annoyingly calm, liked the quiet. He's the sort of person who packs twice as many batteries as you think you'll need and reads trail maps like contracts. I am the person who insists we bring a book and ends up never reading it because my hands are better used for checking locks. That balance mostly worked. The campsite had that pay-by-the-night smell, wet wood diesel from the empty ranger's truck, and the soft rot of old leaves. Crickets worked the edges of sound like a seamstress on overtime. We set up, drank a beer too late, and laughed at our own bad decisions because it's cheap company, and the dark can feel less hungry when you fill it with jokes. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with that band around my chest. At first I told myself to breathe. I tried the box thing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, but halfway through the second round my brain went sideways and I could only get in air in quick, panicked sips. My hands went clammy. The tent felt like a drum around my body. "Mark," I hissed. "I can't." He was already half up, the solid, ridiculous person he is. "Breathe with me," he said, voice low and the kind you want in a dark hallway. He handed me his phone with the flashlight open because he'd done that thing where he knows the exact first two things to offer: light and steadiness. I tried to follow him. I did the breathing. For a few cycles I could feel the band loosen like slack being fed back into a spool. Then something in the world punctured the small order we were making. Out where the lake met the trees there was movement, a silhouette stepping out of the water the way someone steps out of a booth, deliberate and somehow private. I could see it because the phone's beam tracked it. The light caught the shape and washed in the truth. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. It moved with a kind of ungainly dignity, like an animal that had practiced being a person. It looked like a dog and didn't at the same time. Narrow muzzle, too wide mouth open in a half pause that revealed too many teeth, a back that dipped into the water like it was made to be slick. The coat, that's the only thing that ever really zeroes in my memory, looked matted and shining the way something that spends as much time in water as this thing would be. And its eyes caught the light and turned molten. They didn't reflect so much as keep the light and look at you with it. For a second I thought I'd morph the image into sanity. Hyena-ish, I told myself, maybe some weird dog, an escaped animal from one of those farms we passed. Then the thing held still, and its gaze found me. Not aggressive, not hunting, just curious like a cat at the foot of your bed, except the curiosity tightened my throat and made me taste metal. I felt like it had checked me off a list. Human, fragile, interesting. "Don't move," Mark whispered. He put his hand on my elbow the way a steadying bolt is pressed into a door. I tried to move backward, and the thing did a small step away, the water parting soundlessly around its legs. It didn't splash like an animal excited. It slid into the black as if the lake had been waiting for it to go home. No noise, no dramatic exit, just a slide into shadow. I couldn't sleep after that. Not in the normal way. We sat in the car with the heater on, a ridiculous late-night radio station playing like someone trying to wallpaper over the silence. Mark was calm in a way that made me both grateful and annoyed. "Probably a big dog," he kept saying, as if repetition turned it into fact. I wanted him to be right. I wanted to go back into the cabin, sleep like the world hadn't shifted. But my chest still cramped at every whisper of wind. I ended up sleeping in the car because the hard shell of the seat felt safer than canvas. The car smelled like upholstery and his cologne and my fear, all of it sanded together into memory. In the morning we walked the shoreline, because that's what you do when you need evidence for the rabbit hole your mind is starting to dig. The mud held footprints that weren't quite human and not quite canine either, long strides that staggered. Bits of reed were broken like broom wisps. There was a narrow smear along the bank that when you leaned close smelled faintly of iron. Mark crouched and scooped some into his gloved hand and made an empty face. "If I post this on some forum we'll be scrambled," he said, half joking but the edge was real. We told Liz and Aaron when we got back to the main town for coffee. They're the kind of friends who'd sooner call bullshit than indulge delusion, the good kind of skeptical you want on your side. Liz laughed first, because that's always the safe move, then said, "You saw a fox or something. Lakes create shapes." Aaron nodded. "Use that particular tone you use when you want to be supportive, but don't want to be dragged into somebody else's night vision. You probably had a panic thing that made you more sensitive," he said. That one landed like a cold hand. Part of me wanted to slam the table and insist that I wasn't lying, that my chest hadn't made the thing. Part of me wanted to say thank you for giving a tidy, sanctioned explanation. I find those moments hard, when you want your terror to be believed and you are also ashamed of wanting it. Panic fighters learn to sanitize stories for the sake of being heard. I had a bad night. Instead of I saw an impossible face. I stepped back into both halves at once. I told them what I saw, the mouth, the way it slid, and they gave me what they could, sympathy shaped into rational guesses. After that weekend, I started a small set of rituals. I carry a small flashlight even when I don't need it. The beam clicks against my palm like a heartbeat. I sleep with the bedroom lamp on low when I'm somewhere new. I practice the breath counting when the band tightens. These are humble, thrifty spells for someone trying to live a life who knows that sometimes the world will show you weird things and leave you to reconcile them alone. Mark and I argued about it later in the safe daylight of a kitchen. He wanted a practical debrief. What kind of animal fits the prints? Could someone have been playing a cruel joke? He met fear with investigation, which is his version of love. I wanted validation for how small I'd felt, for the way my body had mistaken the night for a predator. Neither of us was wrong. That's how relationships sit sometimes, both people holding parts of a fractured map. We used to joke that the dead season was the closest thing our town had to a personality. For 6 months the place thrummed, boats, tourists, the neon of the bait shop, and for the other 6 it folded in on itself like someone had closed a book. That December felt like that closed book, low-sodium lights on empty storefronts, windows like black teeth, and the kind of cold that made breath look like the end of the world. I didn't go out to look for anything that night. I went because there was nothing better to do. 3 of us piled into my old Civic, me, Noah, and Tessa. 2 parts nostalgia, 1 part boredom, and the exact ratio you need for terrible decisions. Noah was the kind of guy who loved the look of danger without actually touching it. He'd been out of town for months and came back like an arrow. Same jokes, bigger shoes, and a handful of stories. Tessa, meanwhile, had that quiet weight that comes from losing someone and not knowing where to put the parts of yourself that used to be full of them. Her brother had drowned 2 summers before. The town murmured about it like a secret recipe no one would fully share. I was just the narrator of the 3, the one who remembered the stories my dad told about Point Pleasant and the Mothman, tales traded at kitchen tables like weird recipes, and who liked the extra prickle those stories left on my skin at night. We drove slow, the way you do when you want the drive to be longer than the destination. The radio played old Top 40, a song about college girls and bad decisions that made us laugh in the exact places it was supposed to. We talked about stupid stuff, who'd gotten fat in high school, the guy who still believed in conspiracy theories, until the joking thinned out and the comfortable silence stretched its fingers through the car. We made a loop past the old resort lots, where the lamp posts blinked out like tired candles. The road there is 1 lane winding tight through pines, no intersections, no other cars, just the steady hush of trees breathing. That's when we saw the light, red low, like a tail lamp following the curve of the road behind us. There are simple, boring explanations for that kind of thing. A car, a delivery truck, someone driving slow. Noah joked about following them home to make them wave. We slowed to match the distance, and the light did what lights do. It stayed behind us, steady as a metronome. But then it started closing, not like a car moving faster, but like a shape deciding to shorten the space between us with intent. The distance melted, 30 feet, 15 feet, until it felt like someone had reached out from behind and put a finger against the small of my back. We all felt it, that particular animal knowing that something else is looking at you. Tessa's hand found mine without saying anything. Her fingers were cold as the joke about best summer romance. The radio had been playing earlier, sudden and raw, and exactly the kind of human mistake I would remember for years. The light was 30 feet now. 20. Then nothing. It was gone like someone had reached up and unplugged a lamp. We stopped the car, breath clouding in the gap between us, and the 3 of us laughed, a brittle, stunned noise that did not fit what our guts said. Noah cracked a joke about bad brakes and sleight of hand, and we started to make excuses to ourselves because that's what people do in places where strange things feel as likely as a passing rain. But we couldn't shake how perfect the timing had been. We had spent the night before mocking Mothman lore, quoting old radio lines, and daring each other to be the first to set up a camera on the TNT ruins. Underneath the laughing, a small, stupid piece of my brain whispered that maybe we had done something like name a thing and watch it come. The screech came from the woods not long after. It was a sound that tore the air differently than any animal I'd ever heard, high and metallic and horrible, like someone running a harmonica through a cheese grater and then crumpling the sound into a knife. It echoed off the trunks and bounced between trees, and, because this is where the world starts to rearrange into a story, the hairs on my arms stood so suddenly it felt like electricity. Noah stomped the gas and we moved, not in a speed of bravery, but in the direction the sound didn't come from, away. The town responded as small towns do. In the distance I could hear a patrol car kicking its siren to life, and then, like an answer from the sky, a helicopter, a low, throbbing beast whose spotlight slashed the black like a butcher's blade. People later said the cops got several calls about screams in the woods, voices saying someone was being attacked. But when the search teams got there they found nothing but broken branches and the cold bloom of deer tracks smushed into mud. The next day the town hummed on a different frequency. Rumor is a living thing in small places. It eats on itself and then bleeds into dinner conversations. At the convenience store where we stopped for burnt coffee, the guy behind the counter, who'd seen us pull in the night before, gave my car a look and then looked at me with a kind of half-smile that could not be called friendly. He'd been here too long to be surprised by anything, and for a second his eyes had that old, tired intelligence, like someone who knows the current in a lake by the way it laps at the pier. "You folks get home okay?" he asked, his fingers still wrapped around a styrofoam cup. "Yeah," I said, and his nod was small, as if this was the way everyone answered once they'd seen something odd. He said nothing about the light. But when I walked around to the back of the car to toss out the coffee cup, I noticed it, a smear on the bumper, a thin, dark streak that caught in the frost and refused to explain itself. It wasn't red like blood. It was more like rust smeared thin, a color that matched the old telltale of something once bright and now dulled. On the trunk lid, stuck under the lip, a scrap of fabric clung to the paint, threadbare, red and fraying. I picked it up, and it came off in my fingers like a lie that's been picked at until it unfolds. That little piece of red, dumb as it seems, made the night hard to dismiss. We could have been the victims of a prank. Somebody could have hung a tail light out back and then closed it up. But no one in a sleepy town spends a long night practicing a disappearing light just to feed a handful of kids on a drive past the frozen lots. Later, over cigarettes in a parking lot, Tessa told us about her brother again. How he'd like to go out at night to think. How the town kept a dozen small, careful silences around that summer. She said it quietly, and then we stopped talking about it, because prefacing a rumor with a named loss makes it a memory. I kept remembering the helicopter. The light slicing through the trees had made the whole forest look like a staged set, but the scream left residue, an oil that soaked in. There's a strange moral in being young around things you don't understand. You can either let fear define you, or you can let it sharpen you. I think that night sharpened us. We drove slower the next time we went out, and when we did, we kept the music low and our eyes on the road and the rearview mirror. The red light faded into the list of small-town ghosts, the kind you don't tell outsiders because they smile indulgently and call it folklore. But inside, the town told each other the story in different ways, sometimes as haunted fun, sometimes as a warning. I still remember the way the moon smeared silver over the canvas of our tents that week at camp, like someone had wiped a plate clean and left a thin, cold gloss across everything. I was 14, scrappy and loud in the way only kids who've spent half their life in Boy Scouts can be. The camp was carved into a valley where the river met a lake, the kind of place you learn knots and swear by pocket knives. My friend and I had wandered the dock, cast lines, and then gone to bed with the easy confidence of kids who think the world ends at the treeline. For the first 2 nights, everything was normal. The chorus of frogs, the scrape of canoe oars, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then it started. At first it was almost nothing, a distant shuffle, a whispering like the wind through pine needles. I told myself I was imagining it, that a raccoon had learned how to walk on 2 feet and gossip. The first night I woke at 1 a.m. because of the scratching I heard between the trees. I lay there, chest rising with the wet, nervous breath of someone who suddenly remembers there's more to the dark than shadows, and the sounds faded. By morning I'd chalked it up to a dream and told Steve about it like it was a joke. "Dude, someone's out here whispering like a catty ghost." He rolled his eyes and told me to get some sleep. The second night the noises came back louder. Footsteps that weren't quite footsteps, a low creaking like leather on old bones, then a whisper that threaded right through the fly of the tent. This time I pulled Brian into my tent, and we sat there in our sleeping bags, the two of us pretending bravado while our knuckles made the light whips of our sleeping bag zippers. Pete wandered in half asleep, muttered something about bugs, then drifted back out. The sounds would stop when we moved. They would begin when we lay still again, like the forest itself was testing whether we were brave enough to stay awake. Around 2:30, after what felt like hours of false starts, I called out into the dark, half a dare, half certainty that someone would laugh. Pete answered. He'd been up for a while and said he'd heard it too. That small admission made my stomach drop in a way it only does when a joke stops being funny and something else takes the punchline. We sat in the tent talking, the kind of whispered nonsense kids used to keep fear at bay, while Steve slept like a stone beside us. Outside, the sounds alternated every 10 minutes, a rustle, a pause, a chorus of chirps that sounded almost like laughter, then a horn blast that was too weird to be a car and too deliberate to be an animal. A low, warbling note that could have come from an old movie score, except it punctured the skin in the same place every time. By dawn I had convinced myself this was a prank, an elaborate kid thing. We went about our day like normal. The lake was bright and stupidly cheerful. But the next night, the gap between rationalization and raw fear collapsed. I remember the clearing because it felt like the inside of a mouth, a big, rectangular patch of ground behind our campsite, cut out of the woods like a stage. We were walking past, half joking about ghosts, when at the far end of the clearing something caught my eye. At first it was motionless, a lump, a shadow. I thought it was a deer. Then it stood up. Up close, it was wrong in every bone-deep way. It hobbled, hunched like a dog with its spine miswired, a torso twisted forward as if the creature's shoulders had given up on posture. It stood about 3.5 feet tall, and it had this terrible animal economy to it, legs that seemed built for bursts, not long gallops. But the face. God, the face. Its eyes were two deep orange coins that glowed like tennis balls shoved into a hollowed-out skull. They didn't reflect light, they held it. The head was narrow, the cheeks a weird translucence, like all the warmth had been drained out of it. When it saw us, it didn't flee. It half hobbled, half staggered away toward a ditch, and as it did something flickered along its back. Wings tucked, then half open like a moth about to commit to flight. We followed, which is to say we moved closer because kids are idiots and curiosity is a muscle that flexes even in fear. At the ditch, where it paused, the thing braced itself and eased forward in a jerky, panicked pace. Then it was gone. No sound. No rustle. Just the empty ditch and a weird little pile of leaves disturbed. We did what frightened people do, what I will always regret and simultaneously laugh about in the wrong way. We searched. We checked the waterline, scraping mud with our fingers, looking for tracks. We called out its name in stupid voices. We found nothing except an empty Planter's Peanuts bag 10 feet away, like someone had been picnicking in terror. Hours later, when we were back at the lodge with everyone awake and the sun like a clean law across the trees, the three of us sat with cold coffee and tried to treat the memory like a story. We compared notes, cataloged the details, held up phones and frowned at the grainy videos we had where the darkness ate more than it showed. People told us it was a raccoon, or a child in a mask, or sleep deprivation playing tricks. But the eyes were the thing we kept coming back to, orange and incandescent and wrong. What haunts me isn't just the sight of it. It's the way the woods went quiet, the way even the air had weight, like it had been watching and decided to look away. Afterwards, I became the sort of person who checked the tree twice before leaving a light on at night. I started carrying a cheap LED in my pocket, a talisman that blinked in my palm like a heart. We never proved anything. My friends joked about Mothchild names and we made t-shirts that read "Don't Wake the Eyes," half serious and very wrong. But every so often, at a campfire, at a sleepover, when a radio plays a song that sounds like a horn blown backwards, I catch myself listening for that impossible, medieval-sounding note. I still think about that tiny, hunched figure, the way it let us come close and then decided we weren't worth its attention. Some nights I wonder whether it was injured, bleeding through the woods. Other nights I wonder if it was a scout of something larger.